There are sacred places on this earth where two or more bodies of water come together to form one more powerful body of water. Typically called a confluence, these sacred locations are places of great energy as the waters come together from different directions, churning and spinning into whirlpools before heading off in a similar trajectory. You've probably seen these places, considering that you can't go far in the state of Minnesota without running into some body of water. You've most likely been witness to this magic. We are lucky here to be blessed with many lakes, ponds, rivers, and creeks that at some point mostly all meet up in some way with the mighty Mississippi. Right here in the multi-county Twin Cities area, there are 4 major rivers that confluence together. All are powerful and all are sacred, magical places. So sacred, in fact, that the indigenous Dakota people consider the confluence, or Bedote, as said in Dakota, of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers as the precise spot where they emerged into creation. Here today we celebrate our ingathering and merging of waters, coming together to churn and spin into whirlpools before heading in the same direction, creating something sacred. Today is our ingathering, a homecoming of sorts, where we return to the congregation, churning and spinning reminders of the shared values and principles of our faith. Today we celebrate a merging of waters, a day when we honor the water you shared this week as we stood outside the church, as a symbol of our own trajectories as members of this community coming together again. Today we honor the ultimate act of sharing. In many Unitarian Universalist congregations, ingathering is also celebrated as the water communion. Now, communion can be a tricky word for a lot of people. It can carry a lot of baggage with it from Christian sacraments and the conjuring up of images of priests doling out little tiny wafers and sips of wine, an act that seems to be counterintuitive to our UU practice. This is really a topic for greater discussion after the service or in a small group, so I won't dive too deeply into the semi-controversial use of the word communion, except to say that one of the earliest uses of the word dates back to the 14th century, when communion meant intimate fellowship and an act of sharing. Just that, an act of sharing. No religious attachments, no little round wafers, just simply an act of sharing, which is what the merging of water is for us. We are sharing water, a symbol of power and healing with each other. We are gathering together again in this sacred virtual space, much like the confluence of 2 rivers, to share. Yes, some of you brought actual water to the church this past week, which turned into an amazing time to see one another in person and to safely socially distance on the church lawn to visit for a little while. Today we are at home in our personal sacred spaces, coming together as one on the screen, bringing ourselves to share with one another. Today we participate in the deep spiritual act of sharing. We have returned here together as one community to share in our collective ministry for each other. In an effort to understand more deeply the meaning and symbolism of the merging of waters, I wanted to learn how this tradition began. The original concept of the water communion, or merging of the water service, emerged from many ideas of water rituals tried over time, most of which never caught on throughout Unitarian Universalist congregations. Lucille Shuck Longview and Carolyn McDade, both lay leaders in their congregations, were asked to create a service for the Women and Religion Continental Convocation of Unitarian Universalists in East Lansing, Michigan in 1980. The service they created served as a launching point. They created a worship service centered on confluence, the merging together of sacred water, a universal symbol for women as a deep connection to life. Women brought water to this service as a symbol of what was significant in their lives. Much like our gathering of the waters, there was a common bowl at the center of their sacred space that each participant could pour their water into and then briefly share the meaning that water had for them. Longview and McDade wrote these words about what they had created. When the water has been mingled, it is then experienced in some way by the women gathered together. We have subsequently been in small groups who circled the bowl, putting our hands in it. We have witnessed the water passed around the circle as women used it to heal one another. We have seen ceremonies spontaneously shaped in the moment or carefully planned, each portion reflected upon. During or after the service, there should be an opportunity for those gathered to take a small portion of the water to be carried away. The collected and mingled water thus journeys on into individual lives and often flows into a common bowl at other water ceremonies. As the ritual is continued, water deepens in meaning for us, just as water deepens during its long and winding journey to the sea. Ultimately, they titled their finished worship service and ritual, "Coming Home Like Rivers to a Sea." Now there's a powerful image. Coming home like rivers to the sea. Imagine where it begins. A tiny aquifer, a spring where a small trickle of water emerges from deep underground, flowing slowly into a little stream that becomes a larger creek. The creek continues to flow until it flows right into a river. The waters coming together into that river have come from many other little creeks and springs. That river deepens as more waters are merged into it, and suddenly it finds itself merging into an even larger river. This continues for hundreds of miles, river after river merging together until the land disappears and all the waters that started at our little spring come home to the ocean together. This is a metaphor for us, a metaphor for our gathering here today. Each of us is like a spring flowing into a creek. Where we meet is at the river, a place of empowerment because it is where we come together as community. Our congregation is like that river, flowing together with the merged waters of its people all coming home together. We are indeed returning home. We are all together again after so many months of isolation, of worry, of simply not going any further than a few miles from home. Many members of this church did take time away from Sunday summer services, which has traditionally been a time to devote to other things, usually exploration and travel. We've been experiencing a very different type of exploration this year. We've had time to explore our homes again, time with family, more time for ourselves. We may not have gone far physically, but there's still something profoundly wonderful about returning to our church home, even though we are experiencing it from our own homes. We are changed people this year, bringing a new perspective with us. Just like if we had journeyed far, far away with the promise of returning home to the open arms of people who care about us, so are we now returning to a congregation of open arms of people who support and care about us. We return to a sacred yet virtual space where actually gathering each other up for a great big hug is impossible, but we can and do gather each other up in our hearts. On this day that we honor the water, we have gathered to merge into one. On this day that our metaphorical rivers come home to this ocean, we gather ourselves together to share our new perspectives from our time apart and to remind one another why we came together in community in the first place. For the merging of waters is more than just ritually pouring water together to use for other celebrations and rituals. Like the original water communion, ours holds a much deeper meaning. We are coming home together to remember our covenant with one another. Covenant. Covenant is defined as an agreement or promise between two or more parties, usually something formal. It could be written or verbal promise. It's a word that has its root in Latin, meaning coming together. When you first decided to become a member of this community, you entered into a sacred promise to support and uphold this congregation through our shared values and principles. Whether you thought about it or not, you entered into a beautiful ministry for one another and this church. Today serves as a reminder to one another why we are here. Unitarian Universalism is a living, active tradition. We live into our principles, at least we try to. And on this day of ingathering and homecoming, I think particularly about our sixth principle, which states, we covenant to affirm and promote the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. This more global principle needs to begin at home, at the source of the waters. We did not come into covenant together to have peace, liberty, and justice laid at our feet. We're not here to sit back and be served by this church. We come home to our community today, remembering that we are here to actively serve one another and the world in whatever capacity we are able. Now, this may sound strange, but this church is not here to serve you. You are here to serve the church. Much like that little spring of water trickling up from deep underground, the church can quench your thirst, but it's not going to fill you up. You can only learn so much from a spring, so we have to follow where it goes. We have to see for ourselves where that spring meets the larger water. We have to take action together as community to create change in the world. Our covenant calls upon us to care for one another. You may not know everyone here. You may not be friends with everyone. We may not be able to physically be in the same space, but we are still community. A community that protects, inspires, engages with, and bears witness to each and every single one of us. We gather here in covenant and community, in ministry together as people through which amazing things can be accomplished here and in the world. We are truly the waters traveling from the tiny springs into creeks, into rivers, coming together in places of empowerment and covenant. We are the water that flows between and among all things. Our community is a confluence, a sacred place of great energy. As we and our waters come together from different directions, different corners of our cities, churning and spinning into whirlpools before heading off in a similar trajectory, may we think of ourselves as blessed to be here in this sacred virtual space together. May we remember why we have come home to this community. May we reaffirm our covenant, our coming together like many waters. May we all bring the power, the resilience, and the love of this community into a sacred confluence. We need each of us to make us whole. This time, I'd like you to reflect, or invite you to reflect and think about water, what power water holds for you, what power this community holds for you. We'll take a few minutes in reflection, and if anybody would like to speak, we will call on you. Just be sure to raise your hand and unmute yourself.
I don't see any hands.
I believe it's Lois, right? iPad? Yep, her hand's
Yes.
up.
Hi. Hi. As many of you, maybe all of you know, I grew up on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. I grew up across the street from a spring-fed small lake and 1 mile away from the Atlantic Ocean. I can't describe the pull that water has for me, the way I feel peaceful when I am around it. And then the combination of the sound, the correct sound to me of waves from the Atlantic Ocean combined with the smell of the salt air, that is really my center home.
Anybody else like to comment? Richard, would you like to go ahead? Unmute yourself. There you go.
Hear me now. No, as you know, on my Facebook posting, I live on a pond. And somehow when I get up in the morning, I always kind of check the pond, see what the water's like. And it's kind of a nice start for the day. So, okay.
Elizabeth comments, thinking of communion and the meaning that's been given to it. We humans have a way of incorporating an imagined concept and giving it such importance that it becomes a part of our being and affects our perspective greatly. As we think about something so elemental as water, it strikes me that there is so many people's thinking is so far removed from our elemental natural self and our perspective clouded by our imagined realities. Thank you for that, Elizabeth. Anybody else?
I do see Lynn's hand up, and Lynn will be our last reflection today.
Okay.
Go ahead, Lynn.
Like Beth Strootman, I grew up on a farm, and a little creek ran right behind our house. We children played in that creek all year round. We were always down there. But you know, one of the things I learned from it, besides its beauty, is the power of water. That creek could be just tiny and trickling, or it could be in flood and huge and raging. And we had to learn to respect it in all of its aspects.